Buenas noches, everybody. Welcome.
Welcome, Facebook.
So hi, everyone. Again, my name is Melissa Giroux. I'm a co-founder of EmbraceRace, and I am a mixed race woman, Black and white.
And I'm Andrew Grant Thomas, also co-founder, and I identify as Black or African American.
I use she, her pronouns.
He, him.
And we are also partners in life. So you're hearing some door slamming upstairs.
Those are our children.
The kids who were supposed to get ready for bed sooner, but didn't. So I'm sure you all have similar sort of interruptions throughout the day as well. So we're all used to it by now. We're very excited about this conversation. This webinar is called Building Solidarity Among Black and Latinx Kids and Families. We're excited that you can hear this there is both interpretation in Spanish and in English. If you want to hear the Spanish version, you can click on the globe little icon at the bottom of the screen and you'll have a choice. We thought this was an important conversation and that the people we invited on are exactly the people to have it with, because so often, Andrew and I talk about this a lot, about how race in this country is construed as being oftentimes white or non-white, these binaries, as though there are, everyone on the sort of non-white side is, marching in solidarity and have our position the same and have common interests, which isn't true. So we at EmbraceRace are really concerned with building relationships and solidarity between Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, Asian Americans, Indigenous folks, and multiracial people. So that's part of the conversation we're having tonight. We'll be speaking to folks from We Are, Working to Extend Anti-Racist Education, which is an organization based in Durham, North Carolina. And they deliver anti-racist educational programming. You all might have, there was a video going around for a while, which maybe is the first time I saw Ronda, about their anti-racist camp, summer camp. And so they're really working with kids and trying to bring in a community, bring in kids to their program that really represent the community that they live in Durham. So they're going to talk to us about their challenges with that and the opportunities they see with that and what they're doing. A lot of organizations, including ours, are sort of always, maybe we're always trying to do more and be better, striving, and they're going to tell us about their journey. And Andrew is going to introduce our guests. We're going to talk to them for about 20-25 minutes, and then we're going to take your questions.
Yeah, and one of the things I want to underline about what Melissa said, in addition to the importance of this question of how do you build solidarity within, right, or among Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, is this issue of the journey that they're on, right? It's really very often when you see experts like the ones we have on today, right? Often we present it as if it's a done deal, as if we already have all the answers. One of the things that's wonderful about the conversations we already had with our two guests today is they acknowledge it's very much a process, right? They're working things out. They've worked out some things, they haven't worked out others, and they're willing to share that with us today. So that feels so much more useful than, sort of obscuring everything that might be hard or not yet worked out. Let me introduce our two guests. Really excited to have them. So Dr. Ronda Taylor Bullock is the co-founder and lead curator. Ronda, what's up? Good to see you.
Nice to see you, Ronda.
She's a co-founder and lead curator of We Are, the full name of which is We Are Working to Extend Anti-Racist Education. We Are works to equip children, families, and educators with the knowledge and skills necessary to understand the complexity of racism. We certainly consider, right, We Are a fellow traveler with EmbraceRace. Ronda taught English for almost 10 years in high school in Durham, and prior to getting her doctorate in education, and continues to live in Durham with her husband, Dr. Daniel Calvin Bullock, and her kids, Zion and Zaire. Really, really good to have you, Ronda. And she's joined by her colleague, Dr. Fabiola, Salas Villalobos, who is a geographer, an educator, an author, a program coordinator, and a program evaluator. She also serves as a board member at We Are in Durham with Ronda. And Fabiola has worked 20 years teaching K-16 and is an active member of the Triangle Latinx community since 2002. She is a first-generation brown Latinx immigrant living in North Carolina. Welcome. Great to have you both. And we're going to start where we often like to start. We know that our guests, that this work attracts people for whom, there's a really personal investment. And I think we already get some sense of that from your short biographies. But can you say a little bit more, Rhonda, I'll start with you, about why this investment in anti-racist education for kids and families?
Yes, well, thank you all so much, Andrew and Melissa, for having us on here. This is truly an honor and a pleasure. We are definitely fans of you all, so I thank you for this opportunity. This work is near and dear to my heart, as I'm sure it is for you all and many folks who are out there listening. I was a former high school English teacher and connected to education. And once I went on to get my PhD, this was in fall 2014, a lot was happening in our country. At that point, George Zimmerman had been acquitted of murdering Trayvon Martin. A police officer murdered Mike Brown, and it was we were just in a racial unrest in our country, much like we are now. And Black Lives Matter movement was starting up. I was having my own personal experiences, being re-engaged into a historically white university, and I was also a mom. So all of these things are happening at that same time. I'm loving on my Black babies. I'm a mom. My first experience with racism was at 5 years old, and I haven't forgotten it, when I was in kindergarten. And so all of these things were coming into play at the same time, and I just felt honestly called and led to do anti-racism work on a much more systematic level. And I was thinking about first children, because I had my kids and I didn't want my kids to have the exact same experiences I went through as a kid, even though that's an unrealistic expectation. I was like, what could we do with children where we're helping them to develop healthy racial identities and helping them to better understand racism, anti-racism, and activism? And those were, it was just a combination of those life experiences that went into, by spring 2015, I'm thinking, okay, if I was gonna do something in a much more systematic way, what would it look like? And that's when I started drafting out the ideas of We Are, and reaching out, for one, to my co-founder, my husband, Dr. Daniel Kelvin Bullock, and then to folks like Fabiola.
That's great. Thanks, Rhonda. And yeah, turning to you, Fabiola, and we know from previous conversations and from your bio that, right, your investment in We Are extends beyond We Are. It's manifest in a number of ways. Can you tell us a little bit how you got here?
Yes, I migrated to North Carolina in 2002, and I didn't speak English by then. I started as a fourth grade teacher assistant for two amazing Black women, Tequita Edwards and Crystal Jefferson. And I have this amazing Black principal at the same school, Deshira Mack, who taught me a lot of lessons about how to be a woman of color in North Carolina. Then I became a mother, and interacting with school personnel at my son's schools was very difficult, not just because of the language barrier, because of a human barrier. I didn't know that being a brown Latina was going to influence so much how people treated me, for being completely ignored to receive exaggerated attention about my name, my clothes. It was like I was a different being, and people didn't feel comfortable around me, and they didn't act like themselves around me. 12 years later in grade school, I learned that all those uncomfortable moments, transactions were called microaggressions, and I started having access to all this knowledge about race dynamics in the United States, such as racialization of immigrant groups, etc. And I decided, yes.
Let me just interrupt for just a brief moment to say the interpreters are asking us to slow down, and it started with me, to be clear, but just so that they can keep up.
So I decided to learn and be sure, like Rhonda, then when my children would be in those same experiences about human barriers like I did, that I was going to be able to guide them and help them and support them. And like she said, unrealistically, to prevent them from suffering what I went through. And then I met Rhonda, and I was focusing on figuring out how to make others, how I saw race affecting everything in here, the everyday, all the systems. And Rhonda recommended me to take a course. And in the course, there was a racial equity training, and he had a Black professor. And then my advisor told me to take a course on critical race theory, and there was another Black professor. And then I found a space to have these conversations about race. And then I knew I needed another space to be actively engaged and working on dismantling this system. So magically, Rhonda invited me to be part of We Are. And here we are 5 years later having this conversation tonight. And of course, this is a simplified version of my story. There are many pieces who fell in place for me to have access and opportunities to get where I am right now. But to make emphasis on my story is I mentioned 6 Black women that were crucial in my life in these 18 years in North Carolina for me to be an anti-racist educator. And this is how Black and Brown solidarity looks like in one personal story.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful, right? So we want to hear more about your program and the particular demographics of the area that you're trying to serve and what implications that has for your program and the work you're trying to do. Do you want to start, Rhonda?
I'm gonna pass the mic to Fabiola.
All right. Okay, I'll continue. Well, I'm a geographer, so I start with my special units as the more general one, context of the US, where the Latinx group is the biggest racial minority in the country right now. And it goes to North Carolina, which is a Latinx diaspora state. It refers to areas in the United States that the Latinx communities are new settlers in these areas. That's why we call them new Latinx diasporas. And then goes to Durham, which is a county in North Carolina. And the same phenomenon of growing Latinx population in the United States, in North Carolina, and Durham is happening at in the same levels. For example, from 1990 to 2000, the highest group of immigrants in North Carolina were Latinx in Durham County. And within those 10 years, the population grew from 5,000 to 17,000. Some of these Latinx folks came from Latin America, but some of them came from other states. They're Latinxes from other states. In another of our counties in North Carolina, Wake County, the Latinx population grew from 5,000 to 33,000 within those 10 years. And the Durham Public Schools demographics are 33% Latinx, 41 Black, and 19% white. And that's why when we talk about Black and Brown solidarity for us, because the organization is in Durham, we talk about Latinx groups. But we acknowledge that the Brown also includes Brown folks from all the groups. It's just for our context, that's our demographics. And those are the 2 groups that we're trying to bond together, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. So, and so you all, in doing your work, realized what about who was coming to your program?
Yeah, so I will say that, well, for one, I'm a critical race scholar, and I do critical whiteness studies specifically, and I study white children's racial identity construction. And so a part of wanting to start We Are Camp, yes, I wanted it for Black and Brown kids, but oftentimes when we talk about racial identity, white children are left out. And white children and white families need to be at the table doing racial identity work. And so as an organization, we had an intentional effort of trying to recruit white families into our anti-racism summer camp because we knew Black families know that that's a place for us. And we knew Black families were gonna come. And plus with my connection to the Black community in Durham, we knew we would get folks to come. And so we made an intentional effort to recruit white families because we wanted them at the table, and also because Black and Brown children are oftentimes the victims of white children's racism. And a lot of people don't own or recognize or believe that these types of experiences are happening as early as pre-K, right? And so with that intentional effort, Black children were the majority in our summer camps. Our second largest group was white, and then it was Latinx. So after the second year, because the first year we only had 15 kids, and so it was pretty racially diverse. But then after the second year, it was still a majority Black children, but we were like, where are the Latina children? Where are the Latinx children? And so we were like, okay, we need to change our recruitment efforts. White families understand they're coming. By the third year of the camp, they were the majority in our first through second grade camp. And so we had to think about, actually by the fourth year, white families were the majority. So we had to rethink, okay, we're missing the mark here. So we were like, okay, the second, I think it was maybe the third year, we were like, okay, we need to translate our flyers. Of course, Latinx families aren't going to come our flyers, and our communications aren't even in Spanish. So we needed to do that. We did that, and then that year we went up maybe 1% or 2% of Latinx families. And then we're like, oh, well, in our family orientation, we didn't have a translation. So we needed to have, interpretation. So we didn't have interpretation. So these things that seem so obvious now weren't that obvious at the time. And then we had the interpretation. We had, the translated flyers and the emails, but we still didn't have Latinx families. And so, yes, those pieces matter. But then in conversation with Fabiola, we realized we needed a community connection. And that's when it became like, okay, these other pieces are important and needed, but we need to make sure that this space, not a welcoming space, but this is your space. Like, this is your space too. And Fabiola, I don't know if you want to add on there.
Yes, and we should reach out to some of the Latinx families about their experiences. And I was in contact with them when they had questions, and they were very hesitant to join an anti-racist led by Black, women, and then there was like nobody who looks like them except me. But I was a board member, but I was not actively in the orientations and recruitment, so they never saw a brown face in that interface on orientation meetings, and they didn't hear Spanish. Pardon. So I think that they were, like Ronda said, I think that they were saying that they were trying to go from one space to another space. If they were in white spaces, now they're going to be part of a Black space. So it was hard for them to feel completely feel completely welcome into our space, and that was hard to hear. That was very hard to hear.
Let me ask you a thing. We definitely want to get into both how you saw the challenge, right? How you thought about that community building effort. And I want to go back just a moment where you both have deep roots in education in Durham. Fabiola, you mentioned, right, sort of the, huge increase in the number of Latinx kids in the schools, right? Entering a place that was largely defined by Black and white before that. And what I'm wondering is, and of course, they're coming in with lots of things, like all the people are coming with lots of things with them. But part of that is going to be the school experience, right? And maybe the experience of living in a rapidly diversifying school system and people responding to that. And I wonder if you could give us a little bit of insight into what you were experiencing, what you were seeing, what you were hearing from people in the schools from which you are drawing a lot of the people who are coming into your camp. So how are they responding to that diversification?
Yeah. So on the one hand, it's what I was experiencing when I was teaching, which I taught for almost 10 years at the high school level, is that there wasn't a lot of community building among the Black and Brown students. It was very much segregated within the building. And I taught at a school that was 99% Black and Brown, plus or minus a few percentage points. But it wasn't as much, it was like, this is for Black kids, this is for brown kids. It was separation. I mean, there were some friendships, right, across the lines, but recognizing that we're in this same community, that we, now there's somewhat of the language barrier there. And then there was like, Black-brown tension really, and not, and because sometimes school systems set up Black and brown kids to compete for meager resources, and it's felt among the student body. So I'm thinking about this from the older level, but even in the younger level as well, is I'm seeing in the elementary level this lack of intentional effort of building these this mixed race, this mixed space community, even though we have such a significant proportion of Black and brown kids in our school system.
And it has to be with the context that I mentioned about North Carolina being a Latinx diaspora state. There's not many spaces in the community for the brown people to gather. We're still like trying to integrate it into the spaces in this state, in Durham. It seems very clear that there's spaces for Black people and there's spaces for white people, but there's not clear where are all the brown people hang out? Why are there spaces? And they're so limited. So that's one of the barriers. The community is high. It creates groups in their own neighborhoods, but it's not out there still integrating with the larger community.
Mm-hmm.
That's not happening yet in North Carolina. That's not happening here in Durham.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say, we also have to make this, but we're coming off of very oppressive anti-immigration policies and laws where that fear is stoked. And so it is literally hard for brown people to be in public.
And to trust.
School. I mean, students were being picked up on their way to school and taken to ICE detention centers. And so so it's not even just this isolated piece. It's like there is legitimate fear in being out and in being in public spaces. And so we're having to bring in all this context. So we can't just zoom into why aren't brown kids here. You have to zoom out and consider the whole context with which we're working in.
Right, and even how dangerous solidarity and the implication of using our voices to transform, to create a more just society when you're being targeted. That's I'm sure scary for lots of folks. I wanted to ask a question about specifically the Latinx population and whether you have a significant Afro-Latino population as well, and how if so, how they play into this Black-brown solidarity, or are they just sort of erased?
Right now, they're erased, they blended, and there's also a large population of immigrants from Africa. Mm-hmm. And I noticed how, and this is all in the Black-Brown Solidarity book that is from Resources. And I was volunteering at a literacy center in Durham for ESL classes. So I was observing there, and there were the groups, there were the African immigrants, and then the Latinx immigrants, and then the Afro-Latinos. And then you can see how they were more connected, the Africans, immigrants with the Afro-Latinos than the Afro-Latinos with the Latinos. And it was a very interesting dynamic. And it is something that the Dr. Marquez in his Black and Brown Solidarity book, he mentions how he was a dark Latino who passed for Black and how he was more mixed with them than the other ones. So I think that those boundaries between Black and Latinos and Afro-Latinos, they're very, I don't know how to say it. It doesn't work like we think it works. It doesn't work like you're Latino, you're going in this box. It's like, no, but if you're Black and you're Latino, you might also go in this box. So you might also be welcome and feel more comfortable with them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No, go ahead, Ronda. Yep.
Quick thing, and on top of this, there's also anti-Blackness in Latinx communities as well, anti-immigrant sometimes in Black communities. So there's so many, it's layered. There's no simple answer. And Andrew, as you mentioned earlier, we're in the process, we're in this journey, and we're trying to unpeel those layers and unpack as thoughtfully and as carefully as we can, so that we can do no harm, right? And trying to build this solidarity.
And this is one of our own touchstones, right?
Yeah.
Do no harm.
Yeah,
hopefully do better than that, but do no harm, which is not a trivial right standard.
Yeah.
Again, really appreciate your being willing to talk about this journey in process. So let's return to the camp if you can say a bit more about, what the purpose of the camp has been, what the general kind of work has been, but especially how you've thought about, because again, we know from previous conversations that, some of the obvious things people think about, obvious and really important, the curriculum, for example, right? Who's standing in front of the teachers? Those may be, or who or the teachers are, the instructors are. But I know that you've done a lot more thinking, right, about some other pieces that you'd like to see move, that you'd like to move. So what, can you give us a sense of what that's all about?
Yeah, so with the camp, so I'll say we have one camp for kids in rising first through second grade, and one camp for kids in rising third through fifth grade. It's a week-long camp. And there is research that shows in as little as a week, you can disrupt some of those stereotypes and biases that oftentimes form in young kids' minds. But we use a literacy-based approach to help kids think about race, racism, and skin color and activism in very concrete ways. So whatever book we teach from, we give a copy of it to the kids, and it's theirs to have. So that by the end of the week, they have a home library of books that help them further this learning. And so the main goal of our camp is to help children to develop healthy racial identities. And healthy looks different if you identify as a person of color and if you identify as someone who's white. And we intentionally chose that word over positive because it's telling white children to have a positive identity just felt a little icky for us. But we thought healthy was a word they would understand, that young kids understand, and two, that's what we're working towards. We want to foster healthy racial identities, build a historical understanding of race and racism. And then we also want to equip families with tools and resources which extend anti-racist practices into their homes, into their communities. And so camp is kind of structured like a school day. We have fun, we have a break and snack and, recess, but we tell families it's not a kumbaya camp. You don't send your kids to We Are Anti-Racism Camp to have fun. They will, but we let them know they may experience some deep emotions. They might cry. And we hope that, we're not trying to make kids cry, but we hope that when kids show that emotion, that means their humanity is still intact. Because we all should be upset once we learn about people being treated unfairly because of the color of their skin, right?
How old are these kids, Rhonda?
So first grade, so starting with about 6-year-olds. So we have like a 6 to 8-year-old, 6 to 9, and then what is it, like 9 to 12. So that's the age range there. So about 6 to 12 total. And, but they're also very impressive and amazing and astute because racism doesn't make sense to them.
Right.
They don't explain it away the way adults do. Most kids don't. I will say not all kids, right? All kids are not innocent and they're all not ready for that type of learning. But kids are, and they're, they're like, who would do such a thing? Who would, you mean I can't go to school with my friend who's white or my friend who's black or my friend who's brown? We're like, yeah, those were laws that our country passed. And that's how we also link in helping them understand structural racism. Like we walk them through, like day one is like identity and names and learn the importance of names. Day two for the younger kids is learning about skin color. We use the book, All the Colors We Are, which is a bilingual text. And help them, we're making them race conscious. By day three, we're introducing the word racism and a book that explicitly has that as an example. By day four, we're talking about structural racism. We're talking about Black Lives Matter. We're talking about laws and policies, some that contribute to a healthy community and some that contribute to an unhealthy community. In days 4 and 5, we also throw in activism because we got to show them the hope. We have to show them like, no, there are young kids just like you. You are activists right now. And there are young kids just like you who are standing up because they know this is wrong and they're using their voices. And so we try to end with like, y'all are the future. You can do this work. And there's kids just like you as role models in first graders and fourth graders who are doing this work. So that helps a lot.
It's beautiful. And Rhonda shared the We Are book list with us, or a couple, so we'll make those available later. I wonder, that is really lovely, a lovely week. I wonder how, an amazing week, how it's different in terms of, again, the Black Latinx solidarity, forging that among kids than it is sort of, say, among adults, right, who are the ones that allow their kids to go. Wonder if one of you would want to reflect on that.
I'll say one quick thing, then Fabiola, you can chime in too. Because you talked about curriculum, Andrew, like we're very intentional about all of our books center Black and Brown characters and Black and Brown authors. We do have some books, and those are called culturally authentic texts, when the race and ethnicity of the author aligns with the race and ethnicity of the characters. So that's our priority. We do have some texts that are white authors writing about Black or Brown experiences. Those are minimal, and we're working towards 100% culturally authentic. But we're very intentional about the books that we choose, and we're very intentional about the imagery in the books that we choose, because we know that imagery is communicating value, identity, self-esteem. And so we're so there's some books that will be so powerful to engage in, having these race-based conversations, but the imagery doesn't work. And so we just are very intentional about finding Brown authors, and some books that are dual lingual text, and some that center Brown experiences. So for example, in the more recent books, I wish I had brought it out, that we have is Undocumented. And it's like this accordion type book. And it talks about Latinx workers being taken advantage of. And it's written as like a comic book almost, being taken advantage of, and with wage theft, and being afraid to stand up because they're undocumented. And it's told in a way that young kids can understand. And it's relevant, and kids see themselves in it. And for the kids who don't see themselves, they're learning and humanizing this immigrant experience of their campmates and their classmates. That's what I'm doing that on.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think that it is doable to work with the adults and children, bringing this Brown-Black solidarity. But I want to make emphasis that one of the ideas is that we stay away from that Black-Brown wars ideas that are in movies and social media, and the exaggerated. Even published scholars mention trying to divide our groups. And only having this discussion about Black Latinos and Blacks against each other, that takes away the attention from the challenging, which is to challenge the systems that put these groups in disadvantage from the white groups. And then we need to refocus on putting these groups together and see what's the problem, what is putting you in disadvantage on all the systems, the school, judiciaries, health systems, and bring them together. When we have done work with teachers, you can see the Latinx teacher, educators, and the whites and the browns. And before it was a lot of the Black-white binary, but recently in the Institute, there was a presentation about linguicism and language, and that's pertinent to Latinx people. And then we were thinking about having groups that talk about colonization and coloniality, for those teachers to have their history break apart and to decolonize their minds. But it's a different process than with kids, because Latinx people have been consuming anti-Blackness propaganda for years. And it's very ingrained in what the colonizers left for us, the caste system, and with the intersection of popular culture, all those racist jokes and images reproduced in our culture, from the Mexican telenovelas, and when the indigenous brown people are the servants, from the Hollywood movies where Black and brown people are violence. So it takes a lot of time to make that mind shift. And for kids, it's different because they haven't been exposed to all that anti-Blackness propaganda for many years. So it is doable for both groups. We can make all this knowledge accessible to them, but it requires a lot of work to adapt it for each group, for each context. And we need to invest resources, time, energy, and self-care to continue doing this. But this is how we is doing it now. We're focusing more on the needs of each group to help them to come to have these healthy racial identities, children and adults.
Yeah, and so I know has institutes for teachers, right? Like you're training teachers, and I think there's another one happening in November, and you guys can go to the We Are website to see that, and we'll link to stuff. So are there, and in terms of the teachers, is it, like you said, it's harder with adults because they have these ingrained concepts, but in that case, are you dealing with mostly white teachers, or are there some of the same issues of trying to bring in Latinx teachers into the anti-racist conversation?
It's primarily white educators.
Right. Yeah.
One of the things that makes the outreach to the children different than outreach to adult educators is that there aren't that many Latinx teachers in Durham.
Okay.
And I can't just say in Durham. I think that there's a Latinx teacher.
Right.
And
Right.
I wish I knew the number for every Latino children, how many, or it's like for like there's one Latinx teacher for like maybe 120 students, Latinx students. And the ratio for white children, these numbers do not quote me, like, but it's something crazy like that.
Right. Right.
For white children.
Right.
For every 9 children, there's 1 white teacher. And, you know, there's this huge discrepancy. But it is primarily white female educators, I will say, who attend. We do have a significant number, however, Black educators who are attending our workshops. And we do have, and some Latinx teachers as well. It will always be like 2 or 3. We're still trying to, there's some out there we want to bring, however, if you are out there, like we want to bring.
Yeah.
We want to bring more, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So you mentioned the, so I mean, I'm thinking about a few things. So one is, or you at least pre-COVID had a physical community, right? A literal community where people could gather or not. And I know that you've been, you know, attentive to the way that people gather and how you can, right, help build community around in a physical place. Now you have COVID. I'm wondering more generally about, again, we know that you're in transition. It's a process, you're working on it. In, let's say, a year or 2 or whatever timeline is reasonable, what changes what do you hope will happen that hasn't happened yet, or will happen more that hasn't happened enough?
I'm hoping that we connect with additional Latinx-led organizations, and that we start working alongside each other. That we start, and this is some work that Fabiola has already begun in the community, in that rather than trying to make and create this space, meet Latinx families where they are, and then start building co-programming together, and going deeper in our relationships, hosting specific events with that intentionally want to build that solidarity with, so there's a local organization in Durham called Village of Wisdom that really centers on Black genius and Black families. And then there's another organization called Mariposas, which is a neighboring city, Chapel Hill, and Fabiola can add on about that. But in these spaces where those particular communities are highlighted, how can we serve as a bridge in between them? And that's something that we want to become a part of our work going forward, in addition to hiring Latinx people to work in our office. Now, I will say we are a small organization, and we just hired our first full-time employee 2 months ago. And so, but we're young, right? But we have high hopes and high expectations of ourselves. And Fabiola, I don't know if you wanted to add on.
No, it's what we were talking about. We need to create safe spaces for these communities to work together instead of creating something and inviting, like if they're already existing and they feel confident within their own groups, invite the whole group to work with our group and see what comes out of that in a more organic way, instead of, you know, creating a program and inviting and recruiting, but like, oh, they have a program, they're all Latinx, run by Latinx people. Let's invite to a program, they're like mostly Black and run by mostly Black people, and see how can they work together and create something and give them that space, provide that space.
Because they're in these already identity affirming spaces. And now we want to come bring in this anti-racism approach and lens there, and serve as this space where their identities are still affirmed. And now we're trying to learn how a lot of our battles are similar. And we're all challenging this white supremacist system. And how can we do that together?
Together, yes.
Well, we look forward to like keeping apprised of all of it as you guys grow and you know, meet these expectations or what you're aspiring to. I want to go to questions now because we have so many great questions, and folks out there, if you have questions that you want to direct to the panelists or to us, you can put them in the Q&A. I'm going to start with some that we got with registration. So Yvette asks, I would love to hear your thoughts on how racism among immigrant families of different races can be separated from the immigrant concept of assimilation. I find that assimilation into white dominant culture is so prevalent and so important that it exacerbates racism unconsciously. How can one safely avoid this? So there's sort of the difference between assimilating into sort of white supremacy, I suppose, or trying to, and bringing, if you've immigrated, coming with ideas about who Black people are, who people of different nationality, Latinx nationalities are, if you understand the question. Fabiola, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can. We talked about this with Ronda, and I said, listen, we're already code switching to white all the time, and you're asking these Latinx people to go switch to Black now, to be in a different space, and it's tiring, and it's like losing their identity, and the assimilation piece is huge. I was talking to one of my Mexican friends, and he goes to Mexico quite often, and he says, I just feel I'm in a theater all the time. I'm an actor here, acting all the time. And then I need to go and take a break because the assimilation force is so strong. They want you to be somebody who you're not in order to fit and function in all the spaces. It's very difficult. It takes time to understand, and the stay authentic is very important. But it's fighting the system. I can share about my own experience when I was taking my first language class, and I was a supporter of ideas of like standard Spanish is the best Spanish for everybody to speak, and we should use Spanish, standard Spanish. And I wasn't paying attention on how the U.S. uses Spanish as a weapon against Spanish people. And now after learning, I embrace translanguaging, using both languages, English and Spanish. And I don't think that my English is infecting my Spanish, or my Spanish is infecting my English anymore. But that assimilation of you need to speak only English and perfect English. If you're gonna speak Spanish, you need to speak standard Spanish. And that's the one I accepted because it's the one that is taught at schools. All assimilations ideas are very hard to fight. Because again, it's also part of our cultures and our countries too. The whiter you are, the better you speak, the more formal, the more you try to be white and American, the more successful you'll be. And in all that propaganda gets sells to us too.
You've been had, yeah.
The what you just said, Fabiola, and I think you said too, Ronda, right? You've both spoken to, more than touched on the diversity within these populations, right? Obviously, there's not one Latinx community, there's not one Black community. Fabiola, you mentioned, immigrants from Africa, for example, yes. and from various countries in Africa. And of course, this is true of Latinx folks. So we have several questions that get at this. I'll read just one of them. I'd love to explore a conversation about solidarity across the multitude of racial identities within the Latinx community. So this person is, mestiza Salvadoran, who's white presenting, raising 2 white presenting children. She often hesitates to participate in spaces designed for quote unquote people of color, a term we don't use back home in El Salvador. And much of my own work, and that with my young children, is around understanding the intersection of our unearned light-skinned privilege and layering context of our Latinx culture. You mentioned, or maybe it was before we started, Fabiola, our previous webinar about colorism, right? That's going to be another piece that cuts across and within both communities, or all the communities within these larger ones. Just can you say a little something about, managing all that diversity?
Ronda, you want to say something, or you want me to go ahead?
Yeah, no, I think you're best suited for that.
It's bananas. It's difficult. It's very difficult. And I have a presentation that I did for my school for Latinx Hispanic Month one time, presenting my family. I have people who are red hair, blue eyes, who are my cousins. And I have some people who are Black and people who are Asian. And we're all Costa Ricans, or we're all Latinx. And I have a kid who's brown, and I have a kid who looks white. And this is very difficult. And it's very difficult, but still, I go back to what I've been learning with Ronda. You need to keep in mind the book endings of this mess. Ronda, do you want to talk about the book endings?
Yeah, we talk about like the black-white it is a binary, and these are some of the bookends of so much of these the structures of racism, the laws and the policies were very much black and white. So how do we get those bookends in place to understand this? And this is language that we pull from the Racial Equity Institute, which is an organization out of North Carolina, to help set the framework up so that we can better understand all the things, the dynamics that are happening in between those bookends.
And I usually tell my Afro-Latino friends or my white Latino friends about like, but it's, how do you benefit from this? Or what is the benefit? And it's what Ronda said, is to create healthy communities. If we fight anti-Blackness and we get to the bottom of this book ending, which is anti-Blackness within our own Latinx communities, then everybody else in the middle, everybody else in between, all the colors and mixes, everybody benefits. Mm-hmm. Because again, the end goal is to dismantle this white supremacy system. And then that should be our goal. No decide who has more benefits in between. Like, dismantle the white supremacy system, fight anti-Blackness, and everybody will benefit.
Absolutely. So that we have a question about how to build the solidarity and what language to use with children. So I wonder just how specifically, do you specifically address the sort of tensions between Latinx and Black folks that people have likely heard in their homes, right? Kids, in talking to kids or through books? And if through books, are there specific books? I don't know of one that addresses that.
Yeah, we don't have one specifically yet. And I think going back to Andrew's, like, what are your plans in the future? I think that will be there. Like, for one, we have to, again, partner with these Brown-led organizations so that we can be in community with them. And once we create this space, that's where we can start to address with Brown kids, more Brown kids present, and with our Black student population to have those spaces. Because even within our camp, we do caucusing with young kids.
Yes.
It's messy and it's necessary, right? And so we have explicit conversations to make sure kids understand why we're doing this. We really have to do it with adults too, and make sure they understand the difference between segregation and congregation. We very explicitly explain that, and we even have some young kids who can articulate, I'm mixed race, but I'm white passing, because some families have already equipped them with that language to understand, and they understand how their presence in the people of color, the children of color caucus might not be healthy in that moment. I mean, that's such a mature thing for a 7-year-old to articulate, right? And because a 7-year-old can do it, we should expect adults to be able to do and understand and process, those conversations as well. So one, we don't have a text that speaks to that. And if there are authors out there who write children's books right now,
right. I know.
A book in our camp, and but that's something that we would want to do. We've even talked about, like, if we don't see the book out there, how can we create the video, the PowerPoint, the short, so that we can still have some type of centerpiece text to engage kids in that work. And I believe with the work we're going to be building, where we hope we will be with Village of Wisdom and Mariposas, to figure out, this is a space where we can start to grow that work. And those stories might come out of the children, right? And that's another thing.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
We are very responsive to the stories children bring up. So when we go back to the caucusing, so we have a Children of Color caucus and a caucus for kids who identify as white. With mixed race children, we have a conversation with them away from the audience and explain what's happening and ask them what would they like to do. Also, because mixed race children are our third largest demographic, and many of them are struggling right now and trying to figure out how they identify. And so we're very thoughtful about allowing children to name how they see themselves, and we don't get to name that for a child. They have to come into their own understanding. So we're very thoughtful about that. But in this People of Color Caucus, the kids start sharing their stories about, because they recognize when they've been harmed, and now there's someone else who looks like them, or maybe a brown person, or someone who's transracially adopted, or a mixed race person, and they've had similar experiences. Now they see, I'm not alone. Not me. It's not that there's something wrong with me. We're a part of something that's larger. Larger is happening here, and it's not a deficit of me, my brothers and my mother and my family, or the language we speak, or the food that we eat, because of our background. And so it's something about, we know that caucusing for kids of color has been a healing and affirming space. And so we're trying to figure out, again, replicating that and creating that space so we can hear the kids' stories. And so what we found out is day 3 is the first time we bring in this caucus piece, because that's the day we explicitly bring in race for both camps. The stories that the kids of color share, that they experienced on the playground, in the lunchroom, in the classroom, we turn those into scenarios by day 4 and 5 when we caucus again. And we, in the white children's caucus, where we have white co-facilitators in there, they use those scenarios with white children to talk about, okay, how do you be a bystander when you see? So we're using the kids in that camp's own stories, we turn them into scenarios, and now have white children think about, when you see this happening, what could you say? How can you use these anti-racism concepts that we've talked about this week to be a bystander and say something when they witness that happening? And they're realistic, because they're things that they may have, unfortunately, they might have perpetuated.
Right.
We don't ask the kids to name them. We don't say, well, do you see yourself in the scenario? Like, we haven't made them put themselves out there like that. That might be something we do with some older kids, though. But help them, equip them with language. Okay, well, what could you say if you witnessed this? Have you witnessed it before? Not have you done it, but have you witnessed it? And then what could we do differently if we see it again?
I think Ronda, just to finish, I think that Ronda says something. This is what the camps do a beautiful job. It provides language. It gives the kids language and moments to practice. What can I say and do if I'm in this situation? And that's what I'm looking forward for my son to join the camps, because he has been in situations where it's like, but you're white, how can you speak Spanish? And he's like, and I don't have an answer because my mom talks to me in Spanish, and it's all these kids questioning him, like, he's so why he speaks Spanish, his dad is white, all these conflicts, and I can't be after him, preparing him for every situation, but these camps gave them a lot of language in the scenarios for them to be ready to defend themselves, or to say something, or to join, like, not be a bystander and stand up. So that's something very important.
Right.
You mentioned, Rhonda, I think it was you who mentioned early that kids typically don't have the same kind of resistance, right? They see what they see. They are willing to, talk about it, to be forthright about it, to name things that are wrong, to talk about what we can do differently relative to adults, typically. One of the things that we've observed and been super interested in, especially after George Floyd was murdered, and then there were protests, and there were very multiracial protests. You had a lot of college kids, or young adults going home to their parents' homes, right, for the first time maybe since high school, and having conversations that were, super interesting, sometimes difficult, both sides surprising each other at times. What I'm wondering is, after the camp, right, I'm wondering if you hear from children who might be saying, or anticipating going home, or are saying, how do I keep this going, right? How do I keep this going? What if my own parents, right, are actually, as it were, part of the problem, right, or have their own attitudes, biases, that I now have language to identify for why it's problematic, why it's difficult. How do I advocate within my own family, maybe with my siblings? Just what comes next for these kids?
So one of the things that we're developing into our programming is having follow-up with the families afterwards. So follow up with them in the fall, twice in the fall, and then once in the spring. This is something that we just got our feet with last year. We had a parent training like in February, and then we were ready to do something else in spring, and then COVID hit and slowed that progress. But because we are a small organization and we're building, we'll be hiring someone to be our children and families program coordinator, so that we are following up with them throughout the year. And re-engaging that learning, and then pulling, what have you done, or how have you practiced, or what have you noticed since being in the camp, so that they don't, and it's not that they don't lose it, but we want them to continuously be going back to this intentional space with this intentional anti-racism, racial equity, social justice type lens. And that's what we're hoping for. Now, we haven't heard stories about needing to challenge family members from kids, but we have had a story about one rising third grader, mixed race child who was white passing, had to challenge a substitute teacher whom she noticed was mistreating a Black boy in her class. Mm-hmm. So the mom sent us, we get a lot of follow-up emails, like the parents will share and say, hey, I just want to share. And we invite them, like we want them to share their stories with us. So that was one of the stories. And they said, they had already been doing things in their homes. So we're not going to say, you send your kid to We Are Camp and they're going to come out and actively. Not making that promise. So the family had already been doing some things, but the mom said, I think the camp inspired her to speak up. I think it gave her the confidence to recognize that this substitute teacher who identified as white was mistreating this little Black boy. And so the kid said something to the principal, a rising third. Mm-hmm.
That's great. So that's
Thank
lovely.
You.
That's lovely. I was just thinking we do have a lot of questions from people who are wondering how to think about Black Brown solidarity or Black Latinx solidarity in the classroom and how to sort of foster that. And I loved the truth is that, what you said, that there aren't, wasn't it Diverse Book Finder that they were looking for? Krista Aronson was trying to do a study on books that had kids interacting who were racially different or who were
cross-racial friendships. Yeah.
And there were so few that they had to make up books in order to do the study, right? So there really are, it's really...
And that was 2015,
yeah,
not so long ago.
Yeah, and it takes a while to publish books, right? So I think, Ronda, what you were saying about using scenarios, because all of these kids, have stories, is what we found so effective to be with our kids, with other kids, and I wonder if things like tools like that, just being observant as a teacher, and there's this dynamic going on and there's lots of evidence of it, so you can sort of surface that, right, and have the conversation. But I wonder what you would tell teachers, and I know there's different age, you can address any age group that you want.
I think, and this is one unfortunate thing, that because a lot of teachers aren't paying attention and aren't noticing. And when I'm thinking about teachers, I'm thinking because the majority of public school educators in our country are white, like overwhelmingly white and female. And by and large, white people don't think about race. And so they're in a class thinking, in their minds, they've convinced themselves they're just teaching kids, right? I just see kids in my room. And so one of the things that I would tell educators is that we need to be paying attention to the racial dynamics in our classrooms, because they are happening, whether we are seeing them or not, they are happening. And as educators need to be trained to develop that racial equity lens so that they can see what they've been conditioned and taught to not see, right? To make visible what's invisible. So for educators, I would say, for one, attend racial equity training, so that now you come in your classroom and now you're paying attention to these subtleties that you didn't even know were happening before. And then figure out how you can intentionally have conversations, find books that you can find, and if not, use storytelling, use the kids' experiences. Like, this is something that happened in our classroom, I want us to talk about it. And I think being brave to have those conversations, kids actually want them. Mm-hmm. They want to have them. And we have to stop using our adult-centric lens. Mm-hmm. And with all the fears and anxieties and all, kids actually really want to have these conversations, and create, just being willing and open to create that space so that kids can have them.
Yeah, I find that to be so true. Yeah.
So we have a lot of questions. So clearly people are really excited about what you're doing. and asking about resources. We will circulate, right? We'll work with you to sort of generate as many resources that you think are really helpful that you can share, and we'll share those with everyone who's registered. I wanted to close out, we're just almost at time. I wanted to close out by asking sort of a paired question, which is, one, is there something, what would you like people drawn to this topic to, what are the big takeaways, right? What do you want to underline for folks who maybe want to do similar work, analogous work in their own context that you're learning, that you've learned along the way? And is there, and related to that, is there anything that we haven't touched on, right, that you think is really needs to be said before we close out? Fabiola, can I start with you?
Yes, I will, like you said, for kids' books, I will warn you that also there are a lot of brown Black solidarity books published that talks about Black and brown solidarity, but they have this negative narrative about the groups fighting, and even this published. So I would warn people who are going to start buying books on Amazon about Black and brown solidarity to be careful about the author who wrote it and about all the discourse of the failures of the Black brown solidarity. Instead of that, find like the successes and the good stories, and stay away from that, again, from that divisive discourse of Black and brown that is also published out there so much for adults. And also something that I would recommend is to choose a definition of racism that unites groups and not divides these groups, because there are definitions of racism that says that one group can be racist against the other one. But the one that we use for EWR is perfect for maintaining that unity between the groups who are not white. Ronda can talk more about the definition of racism that we are uses. And finally, engage in building solidarity and stay away from those divisive discourses. And because that will, again, change your focus on what we're really trying to do here, which is to dismantle the white systems instead of trying to fight among the groups.
Thank you, Fabiola. Ronda, what's your thinking?
Just some key takeaways, just to echo what Fabiola said, like this solidarity is important. We are fighting this common system, and this common system of white supremacy, and oftentimes it pits us against each other for meager resources, and that's not healthy. And what we need to do to create a healthy community are coexisting is dismantle those structures that lift up whiteness and then oppress everything else, Black and brown and marginalized and LGBTQ and all of the other isms that are oppressed. And we have to keep our eyes focused, and we're more likely to accomplish more when we're doing this alongside each other and not allowing things to be divisive. And I guess another key takeaway with children is that children are making sense of race and racism at very early ages. They are not colorblind. We are not either. And we have to, if we don't start thinking about being intentional about developing healthy racial identities with our children, there are going to be other forces that are communicating these negative, harmful messages about themselves and about others, and they are not going to be prepared to keep their humanity and their dignity intact. So we have to take ownership as educators, as parents, as community members of doing the hard work on their behalf and on behalf of the communities that we want to live in.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I wonder, Ronda, if you could, because Fabiola mentioned it, mentioned the definition of racism that's uniting and not dividing.
One of the ways that we do it and explaining it with young children, we talk about when people use, and put me on spotlight, I'm trying to remember what is the exact definition, when the thoughts, words, and actions are used to treat people unfairly based on skin color. Now that is what we use for kids. Our definition for adults is much more complex than that one, but we like to use the language of treating people unfairly based on skin color. We also incorporate race, religion, and language too in that definition, because kids understand healthy and unhealthy, and they understand fair and unfair, and so we try to make that very accessible for them.
See, you've accessed it. Thank you so much, both of you.
You're definitely doing the hard work.
Yeah, this
Thank
has been
you.
lovely. Yeah, we look forward to keeping in touch about all of it. You're doing great work. So thanks for joining us tonight. And we'll share all that they've shared in the recording tomorrow as well. So
And
thanks for
thank
joining
you
us,
so
folks.
much to our interpreters.
Oh, yes.
And to the other folks. There's far more going on to make this work than the two of us or the four of us.
Yeah, we'll
So
also link to a bunch of Lenguas, the language justice folks who did a great job tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabiola and Ronda.
Gracias. Muchas gracias.
Take care, all.
Good night.
Bye-bye.